Good morning, everybody. Before we start, let me first offer up our prayers for all of those people in Miami as they're still in the middle of a search and rescue for the condos that collapsed in Miami Beach. We're going to continue to keep them in our prayers and hope for the best. And I know Governor DeSantis and his team are working right now. First responders are doing the heroic things they do to try to see if we can save lives, but ultimately to recover any bodies that there are there. So keep them in our prayers. Today we are here with the Doctors Caucus to talk about something we've been calling on for a long time, and that is demanding actual accountability and demanding that Speaker Pelosi hold hearings to investigate the origins of COVID-19. For more than a year now, House Republicans have been making these calls as we've heard more and more reports and evidence mounting that this evil virus may have started in the Wuhan lab. In fact, as more emails become uncovered, that evidence grows daily, and yet Speaker Pelosi still refuses to hold a hearing on the origins of COVID-19. Why would Speaker Pelosi want to try to cover up for what China did? We know the Chinese Communist Party lied and withheld information in those early days, and I'm sure beyond, on what happened, what was going on in that lab and around Wuhan, and ultimately was spread throughout the world. Here in the United States, we've had over 600,000 deaths, nearly 4 million worldwide, and yet Speaker Pelosi still refuses to hold a hearing into the origin of this virus. Well, House Republicans are not going to stand idly by. Next week, Republicans on the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus will be having a hearing into the origins of COVID-19. That'll happen here on Tuesday. We've invited many respected doctors, scientists, as well as members of Congress who have been investigating this on their own to come forward and testify. I still would call on Speaker Pelosi to have the committees of jurisdiction have these hearings as well, where subpoena powers can be used to bring people in, compel people to come and bring the information forward and put it on the table so that America and the world can know what really happened, how this started, and if it did start in that lab, to know how it started in the lab. Was it intentional, even if it was an accident, which, by the way, would make it exponentially worse than Chernobyl. But if it did happen by accident, we should all be demanding answers to how we prevent this from happening again. And so as Speaker Pelosi refuses, we're going to continue as House Republicans to demand those answers. And along with the Doctors Caucus, I'm proud now to introduce our conference chair, Elise Stefanik.
Thank you so much, Steve. The evidence is clear. China lied and Americans died. House Republicans want justice for the American people. We want transparency for the American people and accountability for the more than 600,000 Americans who lost their lives from the COVID-19 virus. That starts with a full investigation into the Chinese Communist Party's role in this public health and economic crisis. Yet Nancy Pelosi and House Democrats continue to stonewall our efforts to investigate the origins of COVID-19, even in the face of mounting evidence each and every day. Why is that? Why would Democrats not want to investigate the origins of this deadly virus and follow the trail of evidence that leads us directly to the Chinese Communist Party? Every American, every community across this country has suffered this past year, and they deserve to know the truth about the COVID cover-up, and House Republicans will not rest until China is held accountable for their role in the COVID-19 virus outbreak and the cover-up which hurt the entire world. Yesterday, Leader McCarthy outlined our roadmap to holding China accountable, and today I am proud that the House Republican Conference is working with our GOP Doctors Caucus, who will provide their expert medical insight on how this happened and the questions we still need answered. They're doing incredible work on this issue. I am proud to introduce my good friend, one of the co-chairs of the GOP Docs Caucus, Dr. Mike Burgess from Texas.
Thank you, Chair Stefanik, and thanks so much for setting this up with police. This is so important. You know, you think from the perspective of whether it be a public health official, primary care physician, a nurse in your community hospital, or even as just as an average American citizen, how frightening to be faced with a new illness about which no one seems to know anything. And every day that you delay getting information about the natural history of that new disease, people are put at risk, and in fact, people die. Look, Congress has an obligation here to exercise its due diligence and to provide answers to the American taxpayers. It's American taxpayer dollars that have gone to fund the World Health Organization, some $4 billion since 2010. China, I suspect, a tiny fraction of that amount. So we do have an obligation to get to the bottom of this, to get the answers. Look, this is the World Health Organization, the very same organization that just took China's word for it that nothing was wrong. So discovering the origins of this virus is not about pointing fingers, it is about saving lives. And it is a necessary step to ensure that we can prevent a future occurrence like this from happening. So we're just supposed to take China's word. Nothing to see here. Just move on. And it'd be like accepting the word of Winnie the Pooh that he's going to guard the honeypot, right? So in 2006, I had the opportunity to go to the World Health Organization, visited there myself. I came back and talked about it on the House floor here. You'll remember that was the time Secretary Leavitt, President Bush were very concerned about an outbreak of avian flu, bird flu. When I spoke about this on the House floor, I said, and it's just as important now as it was 15 years ago, countries need to know that they are not able to simply hide a problem, and that officials at the World Health Organization consider this, then bird flu, now coronavirus, consider this to be a reportable illness with or without the permission of the host country. And that's absolutely critical if we're to get the upper hand from a public health perspective. The World Health Organization has an obligation to us, the American taxpayer. I remember on that trip to Geneva coming away thinking that, you know what, if it wasn't for the CDC embedded in Geneva, the detailees from Atlanta in Geneva, the World Health Organization really would have very little to offer as far as protection for American citizens. It's time for them to step up and do the job that they have been asked to do. It's a pretty simple step, and it's not too much to ask. I'm now pleased to introduce my good friend from Pennsylvania, Dr. John Jones.
Thank you, Dr. Burgess. Last year, it was my privilege to serve as the only physician on the China Task Force. We examined the growing threat of the Chinese Communist Party to our nation's public health, to our economy, and to our way of life. As doctors, we are all trained here to trust evidence-based facts. Over a year ago, the China Task Force began calling for an investigation into the origin of the pandemic. At that time, the mainstream media, Democrats, and others, they dismissed our concerns. Now, every day, more evidence suggests that this virus was engineered in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. First, the genetic makeup of the virus itself dispels theories that this virus originated from bats at a wet market. Contrary to previous SARS or MERS viruses, scientists have found no signs of a natural outbreak of COVID-19 in bat populations. The presence of a double CGG sequence in the COVID virus points to dangerous gain of function acceleration as opposed to a natural origin. At the same time, we know that there is an alarming lack of biosecurity at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Not too long ago, in 2018, the United States State Department raised concerns about this vulnerability. For years, we have known about this risk. Just today, the Wall Street Journal reported that Chinese scientists directed the NIH to delete gene sequences of early COVID-19 cases from a key scientific database. This obstructed Americans' research. At this point, all signs point in the same direction. Now, after lives and livelihoods have been destroyed, we must demand answers. Who are we going to trust? The Chinese Communist Party or the facts? We must demand transparency and we must seek justice. The Dr. Caucus present here today continues to ask these questions. And this spring, Energy and Commerce Committee Republicans opened our investigation and have been conducting a robust review of this pandemic's origins. Understanding how the pandemic originated is one of the most critical public health questions of our time, especially as we seek to prevent future pandemics. On Energy and Commerce, we've already requested information from the NIH, along with many others, about research participants and collaborating organizations. As Dr. Brad Wenstrup will discuss in just a moment, gain-of-function research can be incredibly risky. It alters organisms to make them much more harmful and even more deadly than COVID-19. We should not be sending any NIH funding or any federal grant money to malicious governments. It is time for the NIH to be transparent. Lives and livelihoods are depending on our work, and we must get to the bottom of the virus origin. To continue the discussion this morning, it is now my privilege to introduce my friend from Ohio, Dr. Brad Wenstrup.
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here today. It's extremely important that we have this conversation. You know, I think as you look at the topics at hand today, we have a concern about genetic engineering and a concern about political engineering. And the concern that the United States and the world may have been victims to both. Let's go back to 2012, and there was an article in the American Society for Microbiology. In October 2012, it was reported recently by Weekend Australia. And it was a conversation with Dr. Fauci on gain-of-function research. And they proposed the notion that it's unlikely but conceivable that there could be a turn of events where a scientist becomes infected with one of these viruses, and it could lead to an outbreak and trigger a pandemic. And given that possibility, the question was posed to Dr. Fauci, should the initial experiments have been performed and or published? And his response, and I'll quote from the article, "Scientists working in this field might say, as indeed I have said, that the benefits of such experiments and the resulting knowledge outweigh the risks." I think many people around the world today may disagree, especially after the pandemic and all of its misery. In 2015, a report from US scientist Ralph Baric, along with Chinese scientist Dr. Shi Zhengli, reporting on the gain-of-function research that they were doing. The United States put a pause on it. China continued with it. I want to bring in the entity known as the EcoHealth Alliance, run by Peter Daszak, allegedly involved with gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab. Reported that they have been receiving funds from the United States, possibly even after it was to have stopped. I want to bring some attention to what we recently discovered in Dr. Fauci's emails for you to ponder. January 30th of 2020, he gets an email, Dr. Fauci gets an email from an immunologist, Christian Anderson. And in his conversation, he says, this may have been engineered based on the sequence. Dr. Fauci on February 1st, 20, thanked him, and then immediately alerted his deputy director named Hugh Auchenslaus, an immunologist also. He said, this is important. And in that email, he attached the research, Dr. Baric and Dr. Zhengli. Later on, after Dr. Fauci publicly states that it's unlikely to have come from the lab, even though, as has been mentioned, there's no bat to human evidence. There's no bat that shows that they have this virus. The next day, on April 18th, Dr. Fauci receives a thank you from Peter Daszak from the EcoHealth Alliance, who thanked him for saying that it was unlikely from the lab. Again, we're looking for evidence, we're looking for facts. These are just comments, these are statements, and we're not seeing evidence to support those statements. No evidence supporting any of the other theories as well. No evidence from a wet market and not found in an animal. I've introduced a bill this week that would ban US dollars from funding gain-of-function type of research. It's called Foreign Gain-of-Function Research Prevention Act of 2021. No federal funds to be made available directly or indirectly to conduct or support any gain-of-function research involving a potential pandemic pathogen by a foreign adversary. Any research that seeks to enhance pathogenicity, which is the ability to increase its infectiousness or to transmit the disease, would be banned. And I hope, for the sake of mankind, that this legislation becomes law and lead to a global discussion on the issue. I want to thank you all very much for being here today and for all my colleagues to be here as well, and take any questions you may have.
Questions? Yes.
Hi, Rebecca Downs with Town Hall. How confident are you that the Biden administration is going to really get down to the bottom of this? Because I know they've kind of depended on the WHO. Just, are they doing anything else, you think?
Well, I'm encouraged that they're at least talking about it. Because as you know, all of last year, any conversation about this was swept under the rug. Facebook would not even allow anyone to hypothesize about this gain-of-function research and genetic sequencing for this particular virus. So I'm considering that that's been lifted, and people now have their First Amendment right on Facebook to discuss this. I am encouraged that the Biden administration is talking about it as well. And they set up a commission. We'll see what comes from that, but we hope to be involved with that.
Not just balance it, but
One follow-up on that. I think it's important for the American people to know that the Department of State under the Trump administration was conducting an investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 virus. It was the Biden administration who put a stop to that investigation. That's unacceptable, and Joe Biden should be held accountable for that. That's why House Republicans are continuing to pressure our colleagues who have stonewalled any investigation in the House, because this should not be a partisan issue. This is the biggest pandemic in a century. It's wreaked havoc across communities across this country, and the American people deserve those answers. So while Joe Biden has finally been pressured, make no mistake, they shut down the investigation that was ongoing in the Department of State.
And any delay like that makes it more and more difficult for us to get the facts and makes it easier for China to bury facts.
There is one real concern we have with action President Biden took, and that is he started funding the World Health Organization again after President Trump had cut off the funds when it became clear that WHO had basically started colluding with China, regurgitating their false talking points. It was the WHO early off that said it cannot be transmitted from human to human. That turned out to be a deadly wrong decision, and that's when President Trump cut off their funding. President Biden came in without demanding any reforms at WHO and started giving taxpayer dollars from America to WHO. Dr. Tedros has to go if you're going to clean up and restore the credibility of the World Health Organization. And in the meantime, the United States should not be sending taxpayer funding to an organization that had been lying about the origins of this virus and talking and giving the Chinese Communist Party's talking points. So he should reverse that decision. It was a very flawed decision that President Biden made there.
Hey, whoops, Louise. I wanted to ask you, as part of the select committee on coronavirus crisis in the House, have you had conversations with Mr. Clyburn about whether or not your committee is going to do an investigation into the origins?
Yes, as recently as yesterday, I asked Chairman Clyburn if we would hold a hearing in the select subcommittee on the origin of COVID-19. And this is a conversation we've been having for about a year now. He said he will not be doing that, and ultimately we decided that the House Republicans on the Select Subcommittee will hold a hearing next Tuesday on the origins of coronavirus. So we've asked many times, as recently as yesterday, in the hearing we had with Chairman Powell, the Federal Reserve Chairman, on this issue. It was 2 days ago, actually, was that hearing. So that's when the last time I brought it up to Chairman Clyburn.
Beyond congressional hearings, what is the federal government not doing, in your opinion, to investigate the origins that you want to see happen?
Well, I think that President Biden ought to be reaching out to all countries around the world. Every country was touched in a very devastating way by this evil virus. Every country's had deaths. Again, almost 4 million worldwide, and that's just what's reported. We don't really know how many deaths there are in China and Russia and some other countries, but ultimately President Biden should be getting all countries in the world together to investigate this. You know, if you look at some of the transmissions, when President Trump rightfully ended flights from China, he was criticized, including by President Biden, on that decision, which even Dr. Fauci testified that decision by President Trump saved American lives. But China allowed international flights to still go on, sending people to countries like Italy, for example, which had a very high death rate early off, when they weren't even having flights within China. And so all of those things should be investigated, not just by the United States, but by a coalition of countries from around the world. I would hope to see President Biden want to lead that initiative, but that's the sort of thing that we should be seeing. Everybody that's talking, there were American scientists who were talking to scientists in that lab. We need to get that information out, because the Chinese Communist Party will not share that with us. They won't share it with anyone else. Maybe other countries had similar experiences where they were able to find out some things that over time we might not be able to recapture. Let's get all that evidence out as soon as possible before either evidence is destroyed or before people forget about some of those conversations they may have had a year or a year and a half ago.
Thank you, Please. So yesterday, Ranking Member McCall mentioned that we may never know the truth about the origin of the COVID-19. And also, China has been accused of not being transparent. So I was wondering, what's the goal and what are you hoping to achieve out of these investigations? And do you think that's a big difference?
The reason that we're pressing forward with investigations is because the only way we're going to find out the truth is to start getting those questions answered sooner rather than later. Chairman McCall put out a great report. We've got a few members of the China Task Force here today. That report had some really powerful information, but there's more that we keep finding out. The emails that were recently uncovered that came out after the report raise actually more questions, but the sooner we get those answers, the more likely we're going to be able to find out the truth, because again, it's harder and harder to recreate what happened that day or those weeks and months in advance of what the outbreak started from, because more of that is being concealed by the Chinese Communist Party. We've got to get the answers as soon as we possibly can if we're going to get to the truth, and I think that's what Chairman McCall was talking about. And Chairman McCall, by the way, will be one of the people testifying at the hearing that we're going to be having on Tuesday on the origins, and he will be presenting some additional information that the China Task Force has uncovered.
Yes. If I can add something to that. Most of us here as physicians, I've served on our Board of Health, but all of us have been involved in one way or another at some time with public health. And you cannot just sit back and say, oh well, who knows? You have to dig in. If you are going to solve a problem, if you are going to prevent further spread, if you are going to find out where something came from, you have to have all the facts and all the data. So it's an obligation to, and as far as I'm concerned, in the area of public health, that we continue to dig. Unfortunately, if China doesn't want to participate in the way that the WHO was supposed to operate, which was to be there to benefit humankind, so that we would share data, so that we would know what was going on, so that we would be able to solve problems once they arise, and also try to prevent them in the future. So we're obligated to continue to drive. And maybe there'll be stonewalls. We know there already have been. But we've got to plow through those one way or another, and sooner or later we need to get to the truth about everything if we are going to protect humankind.
Dr. Miller Meeks addresses too, because she's on the subcommittee and has actually asked some of these questions as a public health official.
Representative Dr. Marionette Miller Meeks, and so your question's a good question. It's been over a year. Why does it matter? It matters for public health, it matters for national security, and more importantly, it matters because how we address the next pandemic. So the international community, what can they do? They can set up laboratory standards. So we know that there were safety breaches within this laboratory. We know that there was a level 4 biosecurity. Were they doing research in a level 2, not a level 4? So it's up to the international community and the WHO to help implement those standards across laboratories and what kind of research can be done. So that's why it's important where it came from. And then transparency. If there is an outbreak, if they're doing research on certain types of biological entities, viruses or bacteria, what standards are there for those laboratories, for transmission, for availability of information? If there's a leak, if there's an accidental infection of a member, a scientist, you know, what's the international community's response to that, and what are our requirements for transparency? That's why it's important. That's why the WHO needs to be involved. That's why international communities need to be involved as well.
That February 2nd date that was referenced by Dr. Winstrup really stuck out in my mind, because that was on the same day, I believe, that we had a member briefing on this issue, and we were assured by leaders in public health, and you would recognize the names if I said them. I'm not going to, but look, SARS in 2003, we beat it. We beat it without an antiviral. We beat it without a vaccine. We beat it with public health measures, contact tracing and quarantine, and public health can take care of this problem as well. In fact, I remember being struck by the eerie confidence that this disease is going to behave exactly the same way the one did 20 years before. Now, unfortunately, we know that it didn't, that there was that long latency period. So contact tracing and quarantine became less effective, and it was only the development of antivirals and vaccines, Operation Warp Speed, that finally provided us deliverance from this scourge. But that's why it's so important. You can't always go back and retrace your steps, but where you can and learn, it's critically important to do so. Who knows, 20 years from now, another member of Congress may be up here talking about something similar, referencing something we learned during the investigative process here.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. Thank you to the GOP Docs Caucus for their leadership. You are going to be hearing more from these members who serve on a number of committees, but they bring their unique medical expertise, so thank you very much.
We look forward to seeing you at Tuesday's hearing.
Whip Scalise, do you want to comment on Speaker Pelosi announcing the House Select Committee to investigate January 6th?
Well, again, they were trying to get a bipartisan agreement.
Yeah. Thank you.
The intent was to get a bipartisan agreement, and obviously if you look at the September 11th Commission, they looked at so many things that led up to the day of September 11th and that tragedy, because it wasn't just a one-day event. There was a buildup where there were terrorist organizations that had been plotting that for months and years. In fact, there were attacks on America, including the World Trade Center, years before, and they looked at all of those things. And we've been pushing Speaker Pelosi to have a similar approach to what happened on January 6th, and she still refused to want to have that kind of full-scale investigation, and that's unfortunate.